Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. I am not your host, Mark Fraser. I am but an effigy of Mark Fraser. And this week I am joined by the usual suspect, Mr. Christopher Cusack. Where is Dave this week, Chris?
He's making effigies and he's already made yours, but unfortunately didn't get mine done in time. That's why I'm here in person. And you are in the Bahamas with Dave.
With Dave.
But with Dave's effigy. So the real Dave is making an effigy of me. The real Mark is on holiday with Dave's effigy doing I don't know what. Nobody really wants to know what.
Nobody really knows, yeah.
And the only sane person involved in the entire process is our guest this week. Back once again, the Encyclopaedia Italiana, Encyclopedio Italiano. Would that be better?
No, that was good. Encyclopaedia Italiana. That was perfect.
Ferrucio Quercetti.
Hello. Hi everyone. Nice to be here again.
Absolutely, that guy's accent. We get so many compliments for your accent, Ferruccio. See, when we did the surveys not so long ago, they
really?
were like more of the Italian guy, and they weren't talking about the drunk Luigi.
Yeah, they were not.
We've got two. We've got the sober Italian guy and the drunk Italian guy. And in this case, you're the sober Italian guy.
I can get drunk on by popular demand, or if you want.
Yeah. We could probably sober Luigi up by popular demand.
All right.
It was just fun being that.
Always experiment.
Next time you come to Glasgow, Ferro, we'll get you on the show and get you drunk, and we'll see what happens.
All right, yeah. Why not?
You can get drunk on the subscription payments that we use to get drunk.
Yeah.
But thanks for joining us, Ferro. It's your choice this week, but we'll keep that as a secret for now for anyone that's not aware until we get some stuff out the road. Mm-hmm. Mark, you're the host of this show.
Okay, Chris, thank you. First of all, I want to say what's up to our Danish friends. We are in the Apple Podcast charts for Denmark this week, which is a fantastic result. So I don't know if that's because I was there a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if there's a connection. I didn't listen to the show when I was in Denmark. Maybe I just transmit it as I walk around the country. I don't know.
Could be the effigies.
Maybe that's where it all began. But yeah, thank you to all the Danes for giving us listens. Thank you to all the Patreons for giving us money, of course. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to unsungpod.net/donate. And there are two options for you there. There's one where you can go to our Patreon and you can get some really cool things for your monthly subscription, starting at $2 a month all the way up to literally $10,000 a month. Nobody's done that yet. But if you really wanted to do that, you could. We have mentioned in previous weeks that we're going to change our subscription model. We still plan to do that. We've just been super busy recording. We've been recording a bunch of stuff. And we've been really hard at it. A lot of research as well has been going into this stuff. So we will get down to it. We will get down to doing that. And it's a really exciting thing. And we're really thinking it's going to change the level of subscription and what people get for those subscriptions as well. So a wee teaser for you there. If you don't like long-term commitments, we have PayPal as well. Our tip jar. Just chuck us a couple of quid. We do appreciate when that happens.
We should probably push the tip jar thing, yeah, because we've spoken in the past. There are ways to sort of give the pod a round of applause that aren't necessarily a subscription, mm-hmm. And one of those that we go on about a lot is, please, if you hear an episode, just share it, or rifle back through the catalogue of episodes. There's almost definitely something you listen to in there now, and just give it a share, and that to us is like a wee pat in the back because it gets the name out there. But the other one is go to the tip jar and just chuck a few quid, like we're busking, podcast buskers, that you happen to walk past on your way to work. Yeah, that's also really appreciated because it all goes the same way. The only thing is you don't get the perks.
Yeah, and a good example of the tip jar is a chap called Robert Lawrence very recently just sent us some cash for a beer because he started by going through the archive, got really into Blonde Redhead after the episode on 23 and thought, you know what, I'm going to give those guys a beer. So he did. So you can do stuff like that. It can be a one-off, doesn't have to be recurring. And if you don't have any money, which to be honest, some people don't, like Chris says, a wee share, a shout out to your pals, whatever, sharing something you really like would be much appreciated.
Now, we obviously really encourage interaction with fans. The surveys were really, really interesting. We really appreciate the people that took time to do that. We've learned a lot about the pod from that because, you know, when you're in the midst of it, it's difficult to be objective. So we were taking on board a lot of opinions from our sort of regular guest hosts, Ferrucio, Anna, Vicky, Craig, but also from listeners, people in the orbit of the podcast. The surveys were really fascinating. Ferrucio, use your beautiful dulcet tones by telling us about the album that you chose this week. And actually, I'm so glad you chose this album because this is an album you introduced me to, and I have been dying for you to do an episode about this. So, Ferrucio.
Yeah, it's an album by a band which I'm always surprised, you know, whenever I introduce some friend, especially friends who come from the UK, from Scotland, England or Ireland, because paradoxically they've been lesser known in their homeland, or they're an English band from southern England. They've been lesser known in the homeland than they've been in continental Europe. I'm talking about The Sound from London, and their album Jeopardy. Do I pronounce it right? Jeopardy?
Yeah, so we can do a Scottish version. The Sound, and their album Jeopardy.
Jeopardy, yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's closer to Italian. Closer. I was trying to, like, you know, imitate some kind of English accent.
Can we preempt this by saying, in the era of search engines and SEO, you probably wouldn't call your band The Sound.
Yeah, definitely.
Although
wouldn't.
there was that band, remember, called The Music, which is just suicide in this day and age, because if somebody wants to find you online, The Music Band. But yeah, The Sound.
Yes,
but not back in the day.
You know what? My band is called Cut, and we named ourselves in the mid-90s, and still in the mid-90s, you know, I mean, if we would have done it now, I mean, probably would have chosen a different name, because there's 1,000 things called Cut, and very few of them have anything to do with music. so imagine. I know the problem very well. Anyway, The Sound, one of my favorite bands ever, and Jeopardy, it's probably within my top 5 list of the best post-punk albums I've ever listened to. It's an incredible masterpiece and very much unsung. Here in Italy, they are quite famous. I mean, people mention them in the same breath when they go, you know, in the same sentence when they go, like Bauhaus, I like Joy Division, I like The Cure and Six in the Benches, you know, those like 10 or 12 iconic post-punk bands, you know.
Yeah, so let's, for the benefit of the listeners, let's place them a wee bit, because the bands that I considered to be in that orbit would be, well, obviously one that we'll talk about a lot, Echo and the Bunnymen. Joy Division, you've mentioned. They played with U2, I think. There was the Smiths, Psychedelic Furs to some extent. The Chameleons, Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, a band called the Comsat Angels, which I'm sure you'll be able to tell us about. Is there anyone else that was... I mean, someone mentioned Early Simple Minds as well.
Yeah, I would mention also Teardrop Explodes. Why are they can come in the picture, especially for their earliest recordings, you know? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the ecstasy sound, or like, I wouldn't call it influence, because, you know, the sound basically started as a contemporaries of all those bands, so I guess the influences were mutual at least. But the more psychedelic and poppier influences, I guess that they came about later in the Sounds discography, mid to late 80s. They disbanded in 87, and the last two albums, I think we can say that they might have some kind of late guitar pop psychedelic kind of sounds. They've been added to the sonic palette of the band, but I guess they are to me they're kind of the definition of the post-punk band. They're kind of the perfect specimen. So I when I think about the sound, I think almost, especially if you think about their second album, which I think we'll talk about it briefly too. I think that's like the archetypal kind of post-punk record,
As I mentioned, it was you that introduced me to this band, and whilst there's many bands we've encountered in the course of this podcast that have existed in a bit of a blind spot, what I was struck by, in particular within this album and the second album, was the quality of the songwriting. Because there's a lot of bands you're like, well, okay, that's pretty cool, it's a cool sound, but they maybe just don't have those finished article songs that bands like Susie or The Cure have. But the sound really do. I mean, some of the songs are excellent, and that's what really took me aback. I was like, not only have I missed this band, but this band actually seems to have all the ingredients. They've got a lot of charisma. They've got a really, really great musical aesthetic, but then they also had really well written pieces, and that was pretty exciting. Like I said, that was pretty exciting for me to discover. Mark, I am going to guess that maybe you were in the same boat as that. You weren't familiar with these guys beforehand.
Never heard them before. And this typifies post-punk for me in a lot of ways, and as a result I really don't like them at all. So
well, out of the box early. Well, see, one of the things is we've obviously covered Interpol in the past, and I think this is the kind of band that we all know that Interpol are obviously basing their sound on a previous thing. I don't think they even hide that too much.
No.
And so do bands like Editors and maybe bands like White Lies and stuff like that. But this really seems to be the band that encapsulates their things, because Interpol they were a little bit more driving than The Cure. They were a little bit more direct and rocking than the Smiths, and there were a lot of things about them that you could say, oh, they sound a bit like that, but they're really quite close at times to that combination of flavours that you find in the sound. So I guess before we go too far down that, Ferrucio, do you want to give us a very brief little history lesson on this band?
Well, they formed in London. I mean, the first incarnation of what was later going to be the Sound was called The Outsiders. They were a punk band, and they just made one album.
So you mentioned they only did one record. Was that Calling on Youth? Is that the 1977 LP? Yeah. So it's interesting because I think there were members that went on to be in the Sound in that lineup, weren't there? But the reception was mixed. I mean, I know the album got some good reviews, but I think it was the NME called it tuneless, gormless, and gutless in quite a famous review. Which, given what they would go on to say about the Sound, which was a continuation to some extent of that. It's strange that it jumped so much. How did the membership shift? Because I know that they have a lot of overlap with a number of kind of quite well known bands from back in the day, including bands like Cardiacs and stuff. I
think so. I think the drummer stayed, if I'm correct.
Michael Dudley, Adrian Borland,
exactly.
Graham Bailey, who I think is known as Green on the
side. Graham Bailey, the bass player, Graham Green. Yeah, for the first two albums, has been referred to as Graham Green, and then. B. Marshall, I think she's called Benita Bill 2. I don't know. I mean, in some sources she's referred to as Belinda. Anyway, B. Marshall on the records, and she was the keyboard player. She joined as a keyboard player. I don't know much about where the members were coming from. I mean,
I think after the album that we're discussing, B was replaced by Max Mayers, and that they'd come from Cardiacs, I think.
Yeah, and that influenced the sound very much. I mean, the sound of the sound. At the same time, they formed another band called Second Layer. But I don't think this was very, long-lived. I mean, but then the sound basically took over, and
they went all up. They went up until 1987 as a kind of a practicing group. I mean, things were released afterwards.
The last album was released in 1987. It's called Thunder Up, and I think they broke up around 1989 or something. The last album was Thunder Up from 1987. So basically their lifespan wasn't that long. I mean, less than 10 years, and but it was a pretty intense ride, especially for Adrian Borland. I guess we talk about Adrian's personality as well, because maybe people don't know that he killed himself in 1999. He was affected with serious problems of depression, and I think also he was diagnosed with schizophrenia as well. And so he spent the last years of his life were extremely painful and filled with hardships and problems. And his psychological state deteriorated very much. At the end of the band, I remember reading interviews with several sound members talking about the period around 1987, 88, just before the split. They were saying, that they were trying to convince Adrian to split the band up, saying that he needed a break because the band that was putting a heavy toll on him, and especially in terms of expectations, and that he had. In terms of recognition for the sound as a group, and that he didn't get, obviously.
I believe that aspects of his mental state were starting to manifest, because a lot of people said it was something that wasn't really apparent in the early days, but increasingly as the band went on, they did notice his kind of erratic behaviour. He was always fairly erratic, though, as I understand it. There's a really decent article in Clash by a writer called Robin Murray, who interviewed Mike Dudley from the band.
Exactly, Mike Dudley.
Yeah, and it's a really insightful interview. He makes that point. He's got a really nice phrasing at the start. On the 18th of May each year, fans from all over the world make a pilgrimage to the pit of Lancashire known as Macclesfield to pay tribute to Ian Curtis. And he goes on to say, on the 26th of April each year, there is nothing. There are no 180-gram reissues, no crying fans arrive from Japan, no commemorative box sets, nothing. On the morning of 26th of April 1999, after dealing with a lack of recognition and severe manic depression, he in this case being Adrian Borland, ended many years of internal turmoil. He jumped in front of a train, and the article muses on the frustrations he felt at being that sort of overlooked band of that movement. Robin mentions in that article, the fact they're so overlooked is made even more confusing when you take a look at their contemporaries at the time, all of whom enjoyed much love. They shared their record label, echoing the Bunnymen. They supported a young U2 and could be bunched in with Joy Division, Simple Minds and the Chameleons. Their critical acclaim failed to translate into actual sales, but they had a dedicated, albeit small, following in the UK and achieved bigger success elsewhere in Europe, while holding a healthy disdain for their attention-receiving rivals, the Smiths, which was, as he put it, actually illegal at the time. Such was how unfashionable it was to hate the Smiths. And I think there is a sense that the band had a little bit of resentment, a little bit of animosity for some of their peers. In that article, Mike Dudley refers to echoing the Bunnymen as hairdo and the funny men.
Okay.
And there's also a suggestion, and it's quite interesting, maybe Ferrucio, you'll possibly have a bit more insight in this than we do, but they didn't have the lips of Mac, the glorious pomp of Stephen Patrick, or the ultimate sacrifice of Ian Curtis. People go on about how pop music these days is all about image rather than musical integrity, but the Sound's lack of success could easily be attributed to their non-image. A lead singer carrying a few extra pounds than the norm and a short fuse was not smash hits, pull-out poster material at the time. You know, it seems like they maybe just didn't have the look at an era that, you know, you still, maybe we like to romanticise it as being all about the music, but the look was increasingly important.
I mean, you can argue that, you know, they didn't have the image, the look, as you said. Even if you take a look at the Jeopardy album, it looks fantastic, you know, even the photo in the sleeve, they look like proper gloomy, and, you know, they look amazing in my opinion. But apart from that, I think that, you know, there is a problem with the British press, because, you know, somehow they have to pick a band sometimes and say, okay, out of 10 bands, we have to pick one that we consider shit, and that we can kind of vindicate our role as tastemakers, you know. And I think the Sound got that shortest straw among many post-punk bands of the era, you know. Bauhaus, in certain ways, also Bauhaus had a similar destiny. You know, Bauhaus were so much criticized by the British press that they even called a public conference with journalists, asking them, why do you hate us so much? What we have done to you? And so sometimes there are, you know, these things happen with the British press. I think the British press didn't accept at the time, because now I say luckily their power has diminished sensibly, but the British press had the power to really orientate and you know, and
they were very fickle, especially magazines like NME, whose coolness came from their fickleness. And I think
exactly,
you know, when websites took over, the likes of Pitchfork, which we'll come back to later on, the likes of Pitchfork actually started to reflect that same sense of aloofness.
Absolutely.
The Johnny Cigarettes, you know, reviews that are just so derisory that they don't even mention the music, you know, that kind of thing. But I mean, there was a bit of give and take, because I mean, Mike Dudley acknowledged that when it was put to him that one of the main things about the Sound's lack of success seems that you either had indie bands on indie labels or rock bands on majors. The two scenes were separated. The Sound were an indie band but on a major, so they weren't taken seriously by some indie fans, and they were treated with suspicion by rock fans. It was an incredibly snobby time for guitar scenes. And Mike Dudley's response is, that's an interesting hypothesis, and I suppose there may be something in it. My own feeling is that our lack of further success following a promising start was down to a lack of promotion by the record company, who seemed to prefer focusing their resources on here doing the funny men. To be frank, we didn't do ourselves any favours either. We were a truculent bunch, not the sort to meet a record company halfway over anything, really. Adrian was often spitting angrily about something or other. A journalist was probably unwise enough to ask him what he thought of the Smiths, and I just think he was excoriating Morrissey for being the antithesis of what he considered to be a genuinely passionate artist, like his heroes Iggy Pop and Patti Smith, for instance. Personally, I've always been fond of Morrissey's louche and mocking approach, but that was Adrian for you, forceful when speaking or singing from the heart. So there does seem to be, like a stubbornness and maybe a bit of resentment that built up, you know, by not being accepted. There became a bit of an adversarial relationship, and it sort of pushed the band, no matter how good the music was, they just seemed to get increasingly further from that point of like breakthrough success.
I don't think it was a matter of being on a major label. The Korova was a subsidiary of a major label, but Eco and the Bunnymen were on Korova, and they had a lot of indie cred back then. So they were on the same label as the Sound. So I think it's more what you added later. Maybe the Adrian's attitude was very, very confrontational. I mean, there's a song from Propaganda, which is a collection of early recordings, which is brilliant in my opinion. And there's a song called I think it's called The Music Business. Yeah, it's called the music business. Where I mean, if you think that those are basically demos, but he was already attacking the music business and positioning the sound as a band who was contrary. I mean, criticizing the ways of the music business, right? So I guess they contributed to their. But other bands were doing that too. Think about Public Image Limited. I mean, John Lennon was spitting vitriol against journalists all the time, but it was very common back then to treat the press in a very disdainful way. It was almost part of the game, I mean, what's very strange is that, for instance, the sound played continental Europe quite a lot. They even played small Italian towns like Taranto or Pescara, very close to where I'm from, and they earned the following immediately here, and they are so popular there. They were considered, again, they were talking about Joy Division and the sound as basically equals, So it's so strange that whenever you mention them in the UK, you often get people saying, "Oh no, and I never heard of them," And I think one reason was, the British press was always panning the sound for having childish, basic lyrics. For instance, they attacked this song called Missiles from Jeopardy. Says whoever builds those missiles, when you know what they can do, it's a very simple lyric, and he was ridiculed so much, Adrian Borland, for these lyrics, saying, "Oh, so naive," But I think that was coming with the times, because there were very cynical times, the punk and post-punk era. We were coming from a rejection of the love and peace era from the 70s and the hippies, So he was sending such a anti-war message, and so that was considered as a naive and, almost hippie attitude.
It's strange because that song, the impression it left me with was incredulity. It's not so much that he's trying to make a really insightful political point. It's just an incredulity at the fact that someone can make a weapon that causes that much destruction. Who's doing this? And yeah, I can appreciate how on one hand that could be taken as being a bit glib, my favourite word, because it's a bit easy, it's a bit of a soundbite, but also it is quite an honest expression of just the disbelief that you feel at the fact that there are people out there quite happily going about their daily business 9 to 5, making things that are dropped on kids. And that is something about this band. There's a lot of, especially in this early period, what we'd call piss and vinegar, that a lot of not directionless, but just general frustration and a bit of fury that seems to be sort of progressively supplanted by a bit of melancholia and a bit of introversion. And that is also coincidentally when his mental health problems started to become more apparent. When he wasn't focusing that energy outwards, when he started to turn it inwards, it seemed like he just overall got darker and more troubled and more cantankerous with the press. And it's quite interesting to see that energy, instead of projecting out the way, instead of being exothermic, become endothermic and cause all those problems.
Exactly. As you said, I think that simply is saying, we should think about what we do in our jobs, and do we contribute to the good or to the evil of this world? Should maybe we should take a stand, even if our normal lives seem to have nothing to do with what's happening in countries who are war-stricken, but actually we do have a responsibility, and we can act somehow. And I think that song, in its very simple terms, basically is asking that question, And but back then, I think very cynical times, the punk and post-punk era, and as a reaction to the peace and love and hippie, I think that was taken as a ingenue and naive lyric, and that's all, But again, he was very ridiculed, the single in particular,
It seems like that criticism kind of cut him pretty deep. From what I can tell, just piecing this overall picture together of this guy who felt that the band maybe deserved the attention of some of their peers, and they were getting mocked, and he was having his own personal problems with depression, and they were having an acrimonious relationship with the press, and it seemed like a little bit of a cycle of frustration that just produced some very negative results, and then carry that through post-band into his private life to the point where he ended up taking his own life, and he threw himself in front of a train at Wimbledon Station, I believe, in London.
Yes.
So yeah, it is a really tragic, and sort of at times it sort of reminds me of the guy Frank Grimes from The Simpsons, who I honestly think he's like one of the underrated popular pop culture characters, right? This character who's intelligent, who knows that everything around him is ridiculous, and who gets incredibly frustrated and ends up basically leading to his own destruction through his own frustration at the injustice around him and his sense of, I should be doing better, I deserve to be doing better, and the fact that he doesn't get the breaks leads him to destroy himself. And I don't mean it in any way disrespectfully in the case of Adrian. I think I think Frank Grimes is a brilliant character, and as a metaphor for this guy seems like a combination of mental illness and frustration just led him down a dark path, and it's a shame because he had so much to offer.
I don't know if there were other problems, maybe more private problems, that led him to this choice of taking his life. I don't know about that, but certainly, from all the reports we got from people who were close to him, the frustration, that the arc of his band, for the lack of recognition of his band, was a important part of his state, and especially towards the end of his life, as you said.
So, in terms of the argument for this being an unsung classic, I think we need to just take a quick dip through the catalogue, and we'll do it briefly. Obviously, this was the first album, but prior to that, I know there was an EP that you hold pretty dear, Ferrucio.
Yeah, of course. Physical World, which clearly shows. Together with the propaganda sessions, about which I think maybe we talk later. But it clearly shows that they were a band coming out of the punk era. You can hear the influence of bands like the early Buzzcocks, of Stooges. Yeah, of course. Something in the heart says, move to the army. And also, if you want bands like 999, or it's very Damned. It's a pretty direct, powerful. I would say more punk than post-punk track. I love it, and I love the entire EP. And it's very unpolished. I think one of the best things about the sound at the beginning of their career was that it was pretty direct and garagey.
Mark, I'm curious, did you get a lot out of that EP? Because I would have thought that would be more up your street.
Not really, to be honest, although I did really enjoy Physical World. I think it's a really good song, and it does pop up in Propaganda as well. Unwritten Law obviously is also on Jeopardy. Yeah.
So then, we skip by Jeopardy, which came out in 80, and we get to the big one, From the Lion's Mouth, in 81, which is, if you look up the band, this tends to be the one that's plucked out of the discography. It's it's held as one of the unsung records of the post-punk era. It seems like there's a consistent narrative that it was slightly overshadowed by Heaven Up There by Echo and the Bunnymen, that came out in the same year on the same label. And I think the band themselves feel that Korova put a lot more of their efforts and their money behind that. But over time, From the Lion's Mouth has attracted quite a kind of cult following. It's a really good record. I understand your choice, but in terms of this album itself, what are your feelings on it?
What I got from the Lion's Mouth, I got a bit disappointed, because one of the things that I liked about Jeopardy was the minimalism, the sparseness of the sound, the fact that there was a lot of dynamic, in terms of playing, in terms of and the variety of the songwriting, and the fact that they retained all this punkish energy, even if they were a post-punk band, you can hear that on Jeopardy. I have to say that what I got from the Lion's Mouth, I got a bit disappointed. All of my friends, like all the few like post-punk gurus, older than me, were saying, "Oh, the record is from the Lion's Mouth." I mean, I said, "Okay, this is great," but it doesn't make me punch the air the way that, because probably it's more solemn. I mean, it's been produced by Hugh Jones, who's one of the mainstay producers of post-punk in general. He produced everyone from the Simple Minds to Teardrop Explodes to Econ the Bunnymen, so it's a proper post-punk record. I guess it's their pornography, pornography by The Cure, like this slab of grim noise, very coherent from beginning to end, in terms of sound, in terms of songwriting, in terms of atmosphere. It's a great album. It's a monolith, of post-punk sound.
I mean, given that From the Lion's Mouth, certainly in most people's eyes, seems to be their haymaker punch. They took all of these things, they refined it, they got it produced in such a way. It was really, I don't mean make or break, but it was the record that I think they expected to break them when they heard it. And then the fact that whilst it was very well received, it didn't have that effect, at least not in the UK. It seems that then fed into All Fall Down, the album that came after, which apocryphally is the album where they tried to make an anti-commercial record. I don't think it's necessarily quite as simple as that. I mean, reading interviews with Dudley, he says that the process of doing that album was complicated by what they felt was a lack of faith in their artistic abilities by the label. They found that quite disappointing, and the results were somewhat affected by that. A mixture of them maybe trying to make stuff that was quite palatable, but then also trying to push back against the lack of support they were getting. So it's quite muddled in sound. What are your thoughts on All Fall Down? Because it does seem quite a controversial one in their catalogue.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I don't think it's such an uncommercial album as they claim. I mean, probably because I'm very used to very obnoxious sounds in my life, so it doesn't sound so...
The band seem to stand by it. I mean, certainly some of the electronic aspects in it, I think they look on quite fondly.
Yeah, no, I think it's a pretty good album. I mean, between Jeopardy and From the Lion's Mouth, there is B. Marshall, the woman who was playing keyboards on the first album, was substituted by the new keyboard player, Max Meyers, and I think that influenced the sound very much. The sound became much more 80s, whether B. Marshall had this like almost 60s Farfisa, almost garagey sound that added to this rawness,
quite harsh,
harsh. I love that, I love that dynamic that she brought to the band with her sound. And Max Meyers is a great keyboard player, very revered by a lot of post-punk new wave keyboard players, but his sound is like typically 80s post-punk sound, and you can hear it on All Fall Down as well. The title track All Fall Down is brilliant, I think, and also the second one, Party of the Mind, I think is called. I mean, I think it's a pretty good record. Obviously, it doesn't have like the singles, like Dark Age or Heyday, or it doesn't have like the songs that really stick in your mind, But I think that it's a pretty good album, and perhaps. It started that descending trajectory in terms of momentum for the band, But I think it's an album that should be reassessed in positive terms.
I agree with you. I don't think it's as anti-commercial as perhaps it's portrayed. Maybe that's just a convenient narrative for people that want to write about it. I think All Fall Down's pretty strong. The tones are really nice in the record, especially in that one. And there's a couple of really interesting inclusions throughout it. Monument has acoustic guitars in it, and there's a kind of weird heavy piano motif thing in the verses of In Suspense. It's definitely a little more indulgent, but it's not hard listening.
Usually when I'm doing this podcast, I'll make a playlist of all the songs stand out to me, like throughout a band's discography, and there's none from this record for me.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I listened to it a few times and nothing stuck. Absolutely nothing stuck for me in this one. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's uncommercial, and I wouldn't say that it was unlistenable or I mean, there are songs that could conceivably be singles on this, to be honest. So I think the narrative of it being not quote-unquote commercial is probably a bit bollocks, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly more challenging, I suppose, than
of course,
contemporary music of that kind would have been at the time. But yeah, of all the stuff they've done, I would say this is the weakest, in my opinion.
Interesting. Ferrucio, did they follow that with this Cover Keeps Reality Unreal EP? Is that a collaborative thing they did?
Yes, I have to be honest. It's the record that I have never listened. I don't have an opinion about this one because
I know it's not like canon for them necessarily because it was done in conjunction with someone else. But that was 83, and then in 84 they brought out Shock of Daylight EP, which you already mentioned, which is I think it's actually quite an interesting little EP. It's quite aggressive for the get-go. That song Golden Soldiers really comes flying out. The trumpets are really good in that. It's quite interesting brass. The tones again, the bass tone, and the fact that the bass is the lead in Longest Days is like a bit of a precursor for what became the sort of noise rock sound. There's quite adventurous arrangements. I think Counting the Days, a track that actually that became the title of one of their collections later on, didn't it? I'm moving mountains into that ocean, won't make that sadness any less. I actually felt that was where the XTC vibe was maybe noticeable. Had a really hooky verse, albeit set against really quite morose lyrics, and at times the production was quite reminiscent of sort of poppier Cure stuff. And you mentioned the track Winter, which is a standout interesting song from that because of the arrangement, really moody and slow. 100 days, my feeling has gone, flesh cold and numb, I'm staring in. But it does somehow have the qualities of some quite big 80s pop within that. It's actually quite a fascinating little release, and I feel like it had the makings, like it had the bones of a good album. It's odd that it
exactly. I think it's a mini album. You know, it's running at 33 rounds per minute. So you know, it really sounds like probably they were going for an album and didn't have enough material for the album when they. But you know. It's brilliant. I mean, I think that for my own personal listening pleasure, it comes right after Jeopardy. The first three songs, the side A of the EP, to me, it's one of the best song sequences ever, like in the history of rock music. Now you can hear more psychedelic influences, like psychedelic pop influences via the 80s, obviously.
For me, this is my favourite thing of theirs that they did. I think it's because it's so short. It feels a lot more considered in a way. I like the psychedelic influences; they work a lot better. There is something more poppy about this as well, but not obviously poppy, and a bit more gothy as well, I think.
Well, off the back of that, what was it, 85? They brought out Heads and Hearts, full album this time. A couple of interesting talking points in this one, I think. Again, it starts pretty dark, this record. They've got quite introverted, I think, subject-wise as a band. And he uses this kind of interesting, kind of strained, bluesy vocal technique in that opening tune as well, along with some pick guitar, which feels like a bit of a new look for him. I thought the second track, by the way, Total Recall. Anybody wonder if that's anything to do with the film? I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with this, okay, because I was like, Total Recall, they called the song Total Recall, like, is that a thing that people knew about? Because the film Total Recall was based on a Philip K. Dick short story, but the Philip K. Dick short story was called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. Yeah. So it wasn't called Total Recall, and I couldn't find where Total Recall came from. This is the first incidence of the phrase that I could find at all. So I'm like, that's kind of interesting. But the song itself has a really good chorus.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's a good song, that.
Yeah, and I actually really like the line in it. There must be a hole in your memory. There's something really striking about the way he delivers it.
They must be refs in the story, man. I'm pretty sure the company's called Recall in the story, from what I remember.
I think this is like the first half of this album is brilliant. I think that unfortunately, I think the second half doesn't hold as good as the first 4 or 5 tracks. It's a bit too long. Maybe if it had a couple of songs less, and maybe the polish here is a bit too much on certain tracks,
Michael Dudley actually thinks that Heads and Heart is our worst record. He calls it a real low point, drab, lifeless and miserable. Yeah,
it's interesting also because a lot of people thought it was a return to form when it came out. In fact, if you notice, I think it's got a lot of stars everywhere.
Well, coming out of that then into Thunder Up, which proved to be the last album of their career proper. It's quite an interesting opening because unlike Heads and Hearts, it starts really quite buoyant. It's sort of the opposite end of their spectrum. It's quite upbeat, almost jubilant actually at points in that opening song, Acceleration Group. Big guitar hooks in it. The band feel like a slightly older band, and actually not all that much time has passed at this point, but not a lot from the album stayed with me. I thought Hand of Love was kind of an interesting one.
Good song. I like that song.
Weirdly balladesque. See, the funny thing is, I think it tries to be gorgeous, but I think the vocal take is kind of wobbly, and ultimately the song feels a bit forced. So it's interesting that to you that one stands out as being quite good, and to me, who's overall quite positive about the band, I kind of didn't feel very sincere.
It's funny because the band itself, I mean, I don't know about Adrian Borland, but I remember Michael Dudley saying in an interview that this was one of the records that he holds dearest to his heart because they recorded it basically live in the studio with very few overdubs, and so he says it was a good experience, at least in the studio. I like Kinetic, I like Acceleration Group, I like a few songs out of this. It's one of the records that I've listened. It's not my favorite record. Even if listening back to it, preparing this show, I kind of reevaluated it in a positive way because I kind of like it. I mean, but I wouldn't recommend it as a place to start. Or my experience with this record is less intense than the one I had with other ones. So
both Adrian Borland and Graham Bailey thought this was their best album. Adrian Borland thought it was their best record because for the same reason, because it was live and done in the studio, and Bailey called it the band's crowning glory. Curious
that they must think they went out on a high then, to some extent.
I remember Chris Dudley saying that the two records that he likes the most are Propaganda and Thunder Up, so the very beginning and the very end of the band, probably because during their lifespan things were pretty grim within the band. So probably he remembers the early days when probably there was enthusiasm, and in the end, because probably I don't know, because I guess it looked like they suffered a lot as a band, didn't look like an happy bunch, during their so-called career. I hate when people talk about the career of a band.
Well, and that brings us to the inevitable. Then we should get dug into Jeopardy and find out what the fuss is all about.
All my problems loom larger than life. I can't swallow another slice. Seems like my
This was their first record, and they were absolutely full of energy, and I guess at this point people didn't know what to expect, especially given that first EP was a lot more garagey, even for folks that had followed them then, the small amount of people that might have been aware of them. This would have been a change of direction very early on for them, a big development. So yeah, I mean, Ferro, you're the boss. You want to tell us a bit about this? I mean, to set the scene for listeners, when this first came out, this album got 5-star reviews in Sounds, Melody Maker and NME. And whilst the sales weren't good, the critical reception was really pretty strong early on.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? I mean, I am a huge fan of I Can't Escape Myself. It takes a lot of balls to open an album with a track like that.
What a bolt there. I mean, absolutely. Like a young band doing their first record, and they start with this really sort of esoteric, clever, brooding, complex song.
I'm sick and I'm tired of reasoning. Just wanna break out, shake out this skin.
Honestly, it's only now that it really strikes me as just what a bold decision it was, because this could easily have been sort of mid-album track.
Exactly.
Once you'd sort of established yourself, you take a chance with the audience.
Yeah.
It's incredibly audacious.
They start almost from silence, and then you get this subtle groove kicking in, and this because I mean it's one of the most fascinating albums of openers of all time, in my opinion. Yeah. And the minimalism is fantastic. The way it really reminds me, the first Cure album, Three Imaginary Boys, but done in a much better way. I mean, I love Three Imaginary Boys, but this one ups the ante when it comes to playing with very simple elements and getting the best out of them to create a song that has a unique mood, and I can't get enough. I can't get enough of that song.
There's a couple of things about this song that I think are quite interesting. First would be, for me as a huge Fugazi fan, I think there's a lot of elements in this song that are very reminiscent of Fugazi. I mean, instrumentally, yes, the sparseness of the guitar, the little the dynamic that is used, the way the chords are struck then muted and all those kind of little touches, that's very Fugazi. I mean, all the way through Fugazi, especially like Red Medicine, that kind of era. I think one of the best parts of the song is in the chorus, which is a very short chorus, really, when he says, "I can't escape myself," and there's a backing vocal that comes in. I. And it's the kind of backing vocal that Guy Picciotto does in a lot of Fugazi stuff, a kind of slightly off note of just a yelp in the background.
Shake out this skin. I can't escape myself.
So I think there's a lot of things in it that remind me of what went into making up Fugazi. Maybe when you marry it with
That's true.
4 or something like that. But also, the whole song is built on tension. The entire song is all about tension. I mean, he even says tension in it. It's so many feelings pent up in here. He alludes to that. The wee snarling guitar interjections that appear about 2:35 are just like a kind of bubbling over of that. The little explosions of guitar at the ends of certain lines. That aspect of it is partly why I said I think it's such an impressive introduction to any group.
I always thought it's always kind of weird to be on the other side for once. Like, I often forget what it feels like to be on the other side. But usually when I'm listening to a band's discography, I'll listen to all their albums before I come to the one we're going to do, just so I can get a feel for like where they are in context of their career. And I kind of wish I hadn't done that with this band, because this song really sort of exemplifies everything that I dislike about post-punk in every single way. This keyboard sound in particular just really hurts my ears on I Can't Escape Myself, and just the po-faced nature of the vocal as well just really doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging sound. I can appreciate how that could be quite divisive, yeah. One final thing that I think is quite interesting in hindsight, obviously because of Adrian's passing, the way it happened. People say that it wasn't quite as obvious what was happening with him. His depression, obviously, he was undiagnosed schizophrenic in these days.
It's right there.
The title of the track, I Can't Escape Myself, it's left alone with the one I most fear.
Exactly.
I think there are a lot of clues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even this part of their career.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, yeah. This, as you said, you mentioned the dynamic, and that's what, for instance, makes me prefer this album to From the Lion's Mouth. Is that the dynamic aspect of the sound is very respected here. Like, you get all the nuances, and when the songs explode, they really explode, and they sometimes they explode from almost from silence, or like with a very perceivable crescendo. Whether the production on the Lion's Mouth is great, but it's kind of more homogeneous also in terms of dynamics, internal dynamics of the song. So this song is a perfect example. It encapsulated, it's incredible. It's one of my favorite songs of all time.
So, and the thing is, it's such a bold start that it's a hard thing to follow, but they do follow it in a kind of big way with Heartland, the second song. There's a lot of things that can be said about this song. We talked about Bee's shrill organ, that really propulsive, energetic quality that has. I think there's a lot about this song that really reminds me of the early days of Husker Du. There's a really fuzzy, fizzy tunefulness to it, and a sort of sense of momentum. The chord change that happens underneath the line, "You gotta believe," that third time, I think is just inspired. It's such a clever, lean bit of songwriting. I really think it's a great bit of sequencing too, because you do take that quite esoteric, difficult first song, but then the second tune is just full, fast, full of momentum and energy. Yeah. So going back to that mood that we kind of hinted at, and I can't escape myself, the sort of the early signs of his depression, maybe Hour of Need. Again in its title, but also I think in the lines like "I hate the quiet times, I need some company." I think that's quite a troubling lyric, especially with the benefit of hindsight. The song itself, really broody, quite spacious. I think, again, bizarrely mature writing for a band that's on the third track of its first album.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I like this sparse feeling that the song has, and compressed energy, compressed urgency.
I think saying that it's more straightforward is probably the reason why I like it more. I think the bass line itself is more engaging. I think the synth is less annoying for me in this song, and there's some really nice crunchy guitar sounds on it as well, which I really enjoyed.
I love how they play with so few elements every time. I love this dynamic that they have, especially the first side of the album. Between explosive songs and songs that kind of build up the tension.
The dynamic comes to the fore again in track 4, Words Fail Me. Actually, it sounds like Cut to me, Ferruccio. Yeah, really reminiscent of that Physical World EP. This is one of their most direct, garagey and forceful. It also has a little ska-like quality to the chorus.
Almost, that's true. Yeah. It's a good tune. I always liked it. I'm glad that you think that it sounds like us a little bit. And I don't know.
It's got quite a 70s rock vibe to it, I think, almost, hasn't it? I think it feels more in line with proto-punk. I like the brass on it. It works really well. But when it's all in the mix, I prefer it. But yeah, it's pretty cool.
Then we get to Serious Business of Missiles, which we spoke about. We spoke about that at length earlier on, thematically, so we don't need to revisit that. But what do you make of this one?
I think this one it's a pretty epic tune. It's a proper post-punk tune in terms of delivery and in terms of atmosphere.
For me, it's kind of much like the first song. It kind of typifies post-punk for me in a way that I don't enjoy. I think the atmosphere is pretty cool, but I find it so long and repetitive, you know, and it just kind of pulls me out of it. And I do find who the hell makes these missiles vocal refrain really annoying. So it just pulls me out of the atmosphere of the song. I think there's something about the vocal delivery that I just can't quite enjoy.
So that would be the end of side 1, and they started side 2 in fairly robust fashion with Heyday, which was actually the only single.
Yes, was single.
Never thought they'd let you drown. You were trying to find your feet. Can't believe they cut you down. Can't believe they cut you down. In your head,
Which, again, you know, kicks in loads of piss and vinegar. It actually really reminds me of the early Idlewild stuff, the really rough, scrappy early Idlewild material.
I got a Stooges vibe from that. I like a bit of the Stooges.
And I have to be honest, I love an upstroke bass line. You know, like a bass line played on the up pick. Yep, energetic tune, catchy. Clearly they considered it a really good foot forward. It's not my favourite in the album, but I can see why it seemed like a good ambassador. Yeah,
agree. I like it. It's more straight up punk.
I like it very much, and I think it's a great choice for opening side 2 because it balances with side 1. You know, you have a side 1 that really drags you in slowly with this sparse, sounds, and and instead on side 2 you open up with a song that it breaks down the walls. It's just immediate energy. And so yeah, it's a typical rocker from post punk rocker from the early sound, and I really like it,
So the title track, number 7, arrives second track on side B.
the lower we sink, the less we care why. I know we're in Jeopardy.
Initially I feel that this song, just for the first few moments, swaggers a bit, which is unusual in the context of the record. They don't do that a lot. It's got a really cool line in it: "We are young, but are we strong?" The chorus, however, despite that initial swagger, lands much more urgently and with a hint of anxiety. And yeah, that shrill organ is back in a big way for this tune. It's actually at this point that I realised that the organ reminds me a bit of the use of the organ in the Murder City Devils. They're a band that really got off on that very caustic, chorded organ sound, loads of treble on it,
Yeah, it's one of the most psychedelic, if you want, tracks, if you can use this term, and organ driven. I mean, it's got this desperate lyrics and desperate atmosphere, which is common to most of the album.
And I quite like the loud sort of quiet dynamic on it, and the bass line's got a nice. In fact, a lot of the guitar tones and bass tones on this are quite cool. I like this. I like those elements of this song, and it's got a really nice outro as well. I enjoyed the outro.
Well, you'd actually made a comment earlier on about gothiness, and I think the 8th track on it, Night versus Day, is probably where I heard a real kind of gothy element. Yeah. It's much cooler and a bit more measured. I mean, it's still got a really cacophonous quality to it. I think there's like a weird stabbed key motif that kind of goes throughout, and it's got a sort of anti-chorus as well, a bit of a noise out. The vocals in it are a bit lower and darker, and it's maybe the vocals that are giving me that slightly gothier feel.
It's funny because this song was one of the songs that was already recorded for the propaganda demos, and it's funny because
it does sound slightly different.
Yeah, but strangely enough, you can already hear all the variety within the band's sound on those demos because, for instance, Words Fail Me, which is on the opposite spectrum of this song, if you think about it, in terms of sound and atmosphere, is also coming from those sessions. Yeah. So, so basically, this variety of atmospheres that, after all, characterizes this album was already present on the demos. And it's a very atmospheric track, and the place in the set list is absolutely perfect because it kind of prepares for what's coming next, which is the grand finale of the album.
Yeah, they don't give you a long time to catch your breath though, and when Resistance hits track 9, it immediately sets off with this really urgent guitar lead. I think it's quite an angsty punk refrain to it. Again, organ complements it and kind of motors along on the back of that. The bass is on a mission in this tune. I quite like the fact that this was, it's a little bit cliched, but I like the sort of political call to arms nature of this. Resist. I can imagine people being a bit sniffy about it, but there's something just quite earnest as well that's sort of admirable. There's a great breakdown in this about a minute 50 where the guitar goes to be quite sporadic. It just frankly just rocks.
Yeah, like that.
And there's a great guitar hook that arrives for this big explosive ending with the resist refrain. It's a solid tune, this one, especially arriving so late. They've put a pretty strong track to kind of counterbalance the earlier numbers.
Yeah, definitely.
If the song had less of a post-punk production, it was like produced as a punk song, like it could belong to the repertoire of bands like I don't know, the Clash themselves or any other punk band of the era. And it really shows their punk roots and probably comes from the experience of the Outsiders, not the song itself, but this kind of songwriting and this kind of energy.
Well, another ingredient that they bring to the party is Unwritten Law, which we mentioned obviously is on the Physical World EP. Mark, you said that. Sorry, Mark, you said that earlier on.
Started our faith to keep it alive. We draw the blood, but the law draws the line.
Quite a long tune, but it almost sounds like a different band when it initially arrives. It's got a very krauty feel, which is clearly another aspect of the post-punk movement that was happening around about the same time. The chorus in this one has a big-time Interpol feel. I mean, you could really hear where Interpol got some ideas, and it goes on a few journeys throughout the course of the song, jamming on that theme for quite long passages, and I think there's some backwards samples kind of threaded through it as well, aren't there? It sounds like backwards drums that are interspersed. Again, Ferruccio, I know you're a big fan of the initial EP, so I'm assuming this is a standout one for you as well.
Yeah, it's one of the most dramatic tracks on the album, and it really sets up for the final track, which is another very minimalistic tune.
Yeah, so Desire is a really distinctive way to go out. That it's almost a playful intro.
Yeah.
In my words, in my eyes, can't you feel the desire? We will wait for the night.
You can tell they're toying with the minimalism in it, I think. The kick and the hat, then the bass and the vocal arriving. The track, right from the start, I think has a sense of promise in terms of the promise of what that melody and that construct could emerge as in about 3 minutes' time. Subject-wise, I think lyrically it's quite reminiscent of Joy Division as a tune. I think when the snare and the keys though come in, it's only 50 seconds into the song, but because of these songs go along so fast, it feels like some time has passed. It's a superb lift.
Desire, keep in touch, keep in track of this thing called desire.
It's an interesting ending. The album finishes in an equally esoteric style.
Absolutely. Again, there's an equilibrium, between in the whole album, which is suggested by the set list itself. It ends up in the same minimalistic way in which it has started, also in a kind of almost unfinished feeling. You have the feeling that this is going to lead up to something else, and it almost sounds like something that bands like Young Marble Giants were doing, like this, this using just one or two elements to make a song to create a huge atmosphere. So I think it's a perfect ending for an album.
Yeah, no, I think for me, I like that it's an understated ending, another downer song on a record, which has got quite a few of them. The only thing that I didn't like about it was when the guitars and the keyboard started playing the same thing at the same time. The way the tones kind of come together kind of set my teeth on edge a little bit. But yeah, I think the song itself is alright, yeah.
And the album?
I'm going to sit in the fence for this one, I think.
You don't need to. We're all adults here. We can certainly deal with a little bit of criticism.
It just doesn't grab me. This kind of music is really difficult for me to get into. I like big guitars. I like big things. I'm a maximalist. I'm not really a minimalist, I suppose, when I think about it. So the music, it wouldn't really be something that I'd go back to. However, they are an unsung band of this kind and from this era. Sonically, they're very important because a lot of bands went on to do things which are just like this and probably not even as good as this, to be honest. So that's why I must sit on the fence, because personally, don't really like it. Being pragmatic about it, there's definitely a case for it being in our discography.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, as I mentioned at the start, I was surprised at the quality of the songwriting. When I initially heard I Can't Escape Myself, I had no idea it was the first track on the album, for starters. I just thought it was a really interesting bit of arrangement, and as I say, my Fugazi tastes were firing. I think they're a perfect case for unsung, in the sense that, yeah, they seem to have arrived with a lot of bands that seem to do quite well, and if I'm being perfectly honest, sometimes with those bands I don't entirely get it. And the thing is, I don't entirely get why this band didn't do better, certainly here, than they did. I used that analogy of Frank Grimes from The Simpsons, and I really, really hope people give that the respect it deserves, because it is one of the all-time best episodes of that show. And I find that character, that character of the frustrated, resentful guy who brings about his own self-destruction through that resentment, so compelling. And I think, I'm not saying necessarily, Adrian had mental illness as well, and there was a lot of factors that led to his early death, but clearly one of them is the fact that he felt they should have done better, and I agree, and I think I find it very relatable. Adrian, Frank Grimes, all these people that just the sense of injustice that you feel when you watch people rocket to stardom, and you're like, we're doing that, in fact we're doing that better, what's going on there? And we spoke about the press, and the British press in particular at the time were so pompous and condescending and so self-aware that it must have been infuriating, and that they were insurmountable odds. Once they take a dislike to you, it's very hard to change that. And despite the fact they got positive reviews, they don't seem to have really ever been held in the same high esteem that some of their peers were. And I just think that's really interesting. It's a really interesting sort of Shakespearean type character, and they sort of represent that to me. And and to boot, I think it's a really good record. I can't imagine listening to too much of their other material, if I'm being honest. There's bits and bobs I do really like. From the Lion's Mouth is good, but this seems to be the one that's the Goldilocks zone for me. So yeah, I think it's a good choice, and I'm right behind it.
Yeah, if you want some final words from me, I obviously, almost, I would say, I don't know if something like objectivity ever existed, but in the context, let's say, of the success that other bands had, basically with the same ingredients, in terms of sonically speaking, of the sound, it's really surprising that they didn't get the recognition that other bands got. Because of what you mentioned, what Chris just mentioned, which is like the quality of the songwriting, the performances, and the sound that they had, the fact that they basically ticked all the boxes. I mean, in terms of energy, in terms of intensity, and etc. So I absolutely love the way this album brings together several elements which made the punk and post-punk sound, as we just mentioned, which coming from influences by the Stooges, by some quirky glam rock like Roxy Music, and obviously the punk sound and post-punk sound. So they bridge at mid-60s garage sometimes. So it's got a lot of different atmosphere which are, to me, brought together in an almost perfect way, I would say. So it's one of my favorite post-punk albums of all time. It's very interesting that, in the UK it hasn't been as successful as other albums. The criticism towards Adrian Borland's lyrics, to me, are absolutely misplaced, because even if you think about some of the post-punk or gothic or dark lyrics of the time, most of the time they hide nothing behind the metaphors and the symbolism. At least he was speaking his mind. And we talked about it before. He was asking questions in a very sincere way, and I think this resonates with the times we are living now, where some of our everyday choices need to be put into question, and the way he does it is with extreme intensity and extreme sincerity, and I think this holds up to the times in a great way. So, I'm in love with this record since I'm 18 or 19, and it's one of the records that really I will take with me for all my life, probably. So,
well, it is up to the public to decide if they agree with Ferro or not. So go on our Twitter page, and if you agree, hit yes, and if you disagree, hit no. I mean, this is that simple. It'll take you 2 seconds. So, should we do the Nexus?
We should do the Nexus.
Okay, cool.
A complicated series of connections between different things.
Do I go first, or will I go first?
Well, first of all, Ferro hasn't done one because Brexit.
Because Brexit,
yeah, they put a tax on Nexus from Europe, I'm sorry, guys.
This call's already cost us $500.
These guys don't pay me enough to get the Nexus from Europe.
Mark,
yeah,
want to go first?
Cool. I did this on the bus on the way home today.
Nothing to be proud of.
So the way that this works is one of our listeners gives us a historical figure, a fictional figure, a person basically of any kind, artist,
anything,
any character of any kind, and we must link that person to the artist of the week. So our good pal and frequent contributor Davey Bright decided that we should try and link the band The Sound to a guy called Thomas McLaughlin, who is an English guitar player, music producer and mastering engineer, who is perhaps most well known in certain circles for being a prodigy of Steve Vai. Real name Thomas McLaughlin. He was born in Newcastle and began playing guitar at the age of 8, was noticed by Steve Vai and was then taken under his wing. So yeah, he has since went on to forge something of a career for himself as a virtuoso guitar player. So how am I going to link The Sound, this band from the 80s, to Mr. Thomas McLaughlin / McLaughlin? Well, I'm glad you asked. I can do this quite simply. So the first song on Jeopardy is the song I Can't Escape Myself. That song featured in the 7th episode of a TV show called The Young Pope. Have you guys heard of it or seen it?
Heard of it.
So basically it's this TV show where Jude Law plays a young cardinal from New York who gets basically elected Pope, and he decides that he's going to use his powers of being the Pope to make the Catholic Church even more conservative, and by doing so will be punishing his parents who abandoned him when he was young. Some mental stuff, but that's the long and short of it. He gets involved in debauchery and all kinds of all kinds of things that Catholic priests are not supposed to do, basically. So yeah, this song features in the 7th episode of that when I did some research on what other TV shows or films the sound were synced on, I couldn't find any. This was the only one I could find, which is pretty. Unless anybody else out there can prove me wrong, but I'm happy for them to do that. But this is the only one I could find, which was a boon. When I found it, I was like, yes, I've got a link. So from there, we go to Jude Law. He starred in a film in 2001 called Enemy at the Gates. Don't know if you guys seen that film.
I think I have.
It's pretty.
I was under.
I haven't, sorry.
Yeah, it's a pretty okay film. The story's more interesting. The story of the film is more interesting than the film itself. It follows. He plays a guy called Vasily Zayatev, who's like a Russian sniper, and he gets involved in a sniper battle with the best sniper in the Nazi army, who is played by Mr. Ed Harris. The alleged dual sniper's name is Erwin Koenig, but he's played by Ed Harris in the film. Ed Harris has been in quite a lot of films, probably most notably for me in The Truman Show, where he plays Joseph is the guy's name, the guy that created The Truman Show. He's like the sort of overlord of it. But he also starred in a documentary film about George A. Romero called Dead On, The Life and Cinema of George A. Romero, and it's basically about the whole career of George A. Romero. Loads of interviews with him, with his collaborators, with all of his admirers, to kind of show the impact of his work on the horror genre. One of the people that's interviewed in it is, of course, Mr. John Carpenter. John Carpenter, famous director, famous musician as well, mostly known as a musician now, hasn't done a film for quite some time. He's done a few collaborations, including some with people that we know, in some cases know quite well. He has also collaborated with a band called Gunship. Have you guys ever heard of the band Gunship?
No, sorry.
So yeah, that's fine. You shouldn't. I'd be surprised if you heard of them. You ever heard of a band called Fight Star?
Yes.
Yeah, so two of the guys that are in Fight Star went on to form this synthwave side project called Gunship. And it's all kind of based on 80s dystopian stuff. So he appears on their second album, Dark All Day. He's one of the collaborators on it, including the writer of Alter Carbon, Richard K. Morgan, Kat Von D, Will Wheaton. A whole bunch of people have collaborated with these guys, including our good friend Mr. Thomas McLaughlin, who is on a single called The Video Game Champion, where he contributes guitar. So there you go.
Jinx.
Oh, wow. You thought of all this on the bus?
Yes, all on the bus, yeah. As I was negotiating, as the bus driver.
As he was standing there, and the guy's like, could you just pay for your ticket? Mark's just standing there thinking all of this as he's...
I'm impressed.
as the bus was negotiating protesters for COP26, sorry.
Okay, my turn. The artwork from the cover of From the Lion's Mouth is Daniel in the Lion's Den by the artist Breton Rivière from 1872, I believe. That is obviously based on the Bible story. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den by Darius the Mede, who was actually likely a fictitious ruler, placed between two real rulers, Belshazzar and Cyrus the Great. And during Daniel's time in the lion's den, he is supposed to have had a series of visions as detailed in the second half of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. The book of Daniel goes on to describe these, and they are mostly end times revelations, and famously they include 4 great beasts rising from the sea. Now the first 3 beasts are described in quite graphic detail, like kind of monsterish in the kind of old time style. The 4th one's a bit unusual though, and it's not really made that explicit what it is, but the 4th beast has 10 horns, it has teeth of iron and brass claws, and I think historians have kind of considered it to be a depiction of the Roman Empire, the brass and the iron and all these kind of things. And from amongst the 10 horns on this beast supposedly sprouts a smaller horn that causes 3 of the bigger ones to fall out. The smaller horn then grows bigger than any of the other horns, all the while the horn speaking boastfully and with the countenance of a man. So the horn gets like human features and starts boasting and bragging and is very arrogant. I mean, that's some... Like, I ate a lot of cheese before bedtime.
Yeah.
And opinions on that aspect vary, but in sort of many modern apocalyptic religious interpretations, this is seen to represent an antichrist figure, the small horn that grows into the big horn, being an antichrist figure emerging from within a cabal of 10 world leaders to seize control of Earth. It has a lot of parallels with Revelations 13 and the Antichrist description, 10 horns, things like that. Now, as end times revelations go, another religious figure who claimed to be receiving revelations directly from God was a guy called Ervil LeBaron. Ervil LeBaron had 13 wives and believed in blood atonement. Now, he was a Mormon. His father, not even him, his father had been excommunicated when the Mormon Church officially abandoned polygamy in 1890, and his father had moved south to set up his own church, I think it was in New Mexico, and continue shagging multiple women.
As you do.
For Ervil, that's Ervil, and yes, that is evil with an R in it. After splitting with his brother over the leadership of the sect, once his dad passed away, Ervil went and set up his own little sect called Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God, and he then had his brother murdered.
Why is that name familiar? That name's familiar to me.
I don't know if the listeners want to know too much about what you get up to. He was actually convicted of his brother's murder and escaped further prosecution on a technicality or jail sentence or murder or whatever happens in New Mexico. And then he promptly tried to have his other brother murdered, the guy who had then taken over the original sect after he'd murdered the original brother. He wasn't initially successful with that. He may well have been in the long term, we don't know. He ordered multiple other murders over the next few years, usually involving the help of immediate family members, and that actually included his own pregnant 17-year-old daughter who was trying to leave his cult at the time. All in all, it's sort of estimated that he's behind about 20 deaths, and following his own death, he was found in his jail cell with a damaged throat, and it's worth noting that the coroner registered the verdict of suicide. They believe that, this is no joke, they believe that he punched himself in his own throat to crush his own larynx and windpipe, or that he might have taken pills. Which is all very vague. I think there's a bit of difference. Anyway, it turns out a lot of people weren't too keen on him, because after his death, many of his followers and associates died, including a number of people who'd been implicated in murders on his behalf, and also including that brother that had originally survived. He died in a car accident 2 days after Ervil's death. So yeah, it was all pretty messy. But in the 1993 movie of Ervil LeBaron's life, named Prophet of Evil, LeBaron was played by Mr. Brian Dennehy. And his son Isaac, an unfortunate lad, was played by an actor called Daniel Cooksey. Daniel Cooksey is actually a famous animation voice actor, and he was also one of the main characters in the show Different Strokes, which was massive if you're American, and he is, probably more importantly for us, John Connor's pal from Terminator 2, the wee guy, the wee Raj in a bike. Yeah. For the record, that wee guy Isaac, who he plays in the film, testified against members of the cult, and afterwards moved in with his sister and her partner, and was found dead just a few days later. And whilst again it was recorded as suicide, many investigators believe he was murdered by his sister and her partner as revenge for him testifying against the cult. Anyway, the guy Daniel Cooksey that I mentioned, John Connor's pal, Different Strokes animation voice actor, was also the singer in a band called Bad for Good.
You want it rough, you got it rough. You want it tough, you got it tough. You want it mean, well I'm mean. I'm bad.
19. Bad for Good was put together by Interscope Records. It featured Brooks Wackerman on drums, and it also featured the guitarist Thomas McRocklin. It had actually been built around him because he was at the time the youngest person ever signed to the label and a bit of a guitar genius, having played, was at the age of 8 when he played with Steve Vai in that video, and he was on stage at 11. And
Steve Vai produced that album.
That's right, and he'd been playing since he was 4. Anyway, it's crap guitar. I mean, it sounds like shit, but he's really good at it. Played in Dragon Force, that's all you need to know. But there you go, Thomas McRocklin, via loads of murder and religious nut jobs.
Yep, so that was really good.
That's good. You know what? You mentioned the young Pope, the series, and the director, Paolo Sorrentino, is Italian, and is from that generation that probably discovered all these bands, because I think he's in his late 50s or something now. And he is a huge post-punk fan.
Oh, wow.
So I guess that the title, I Can't Escape Myself, comes directly from the reference to the sound. It also, another film of his is This Must Be the Place, which is taken from the famous Talking Heads song. So I guess the reference is very straightforward. I mean, direct in this case.
Joining the dots.
So, obviously, a big feature of this episode has been the role of the press back in the 80s, the snobby, especially British press, NME, all that lot, and their opinions. And it just so happens that is going to be a recurring theme next week, because we have something quite special in store. Well, is it special? It shouldn't be special, but it turns out it is, because he's just finished his effigies and fucking Dave Weaver is going to be back in the game. David fucking Weaver, can you believe it?
The most special of all guests.
So we came across this article about Pitchfork albums that had been horribly underrated, and the magazine is now doing a revisionist history of the albums that they made fun of, and they now accept they were just fucking being smart arses and talking shit. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do a mixtape, which we've not done in a while, do a mixtape that was the albums most severely underrated by Pitchfork at their smart arsiest, and thereby give us a window to commentate on the world of music journalism, which it turns out me, Mark and David are all horribly familiar with, and I'm sure you are in your own way too, Ferruccio.
Absolutely.
You did some music journalism for quite a while, so we are going to talk about that, what motivates them, what's wrong with us, what's wrong with them, what a bunch of wankers, all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, we're going to pick out records that Pitchfork has shat on that didn't deserve it. And I think we might also, for good luck, pick out records that Pitchfork has vaunted and that are absolutely bollocks.
Yes. It's going to be a fun episode. I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be a belter. And for that episode,
Nexus.
better tell Dave this, we're going to do a Nexus, obviously. We'll each be picking a record and we'll each have to Nexus it, so there won't be any overlap, hopefully. And so the Nexus for next week is by Vicky, and it's me.
So we need to like Christopher Cusack to each of our records. That's going to be really easy.
Fucking
It's not really an Nexus then, is it?
well, that's gonna have some interesting results, especially from Dave, I suspect.
Please give my greetings to Dave. It's a long time.
We will do. Ferruccio, thanks so much. As
no problem.
Ever, just so full of knowledge and effusing over this album that you clearly absolutely love, and understand why. Well, we're going to get you back, obviously. Any ideas what you might want to cover next time you're on?
Yeah, I have a suggestion actually. I mean, I'm going to do my mini Nexus now, very short one. Hugh Jones has produced the second album by Sound, from The Lion's Mouth, and he's been a huge producer for post-punk and new wave in general, and especially, I would say, straightforward post-punk rather than new wave. And he also produced a band which was born out of the ashes of the Undertones called Death Petrol Emotion. Yeah. And they made like 3 or 4 albums in the mid 80s, from the mid 80s until the very early 90s. And I think at least their debut and the second album, the debut is called Manic Pop Thrill, the second album is called Babel, are 2 great albums that have always, to me, are at the moment almost forgotten. But I think that they're like fantastic records that should be reevaluated and reassessed. They're very unsung currently, at least.
I believe you. So, next time we see Ferruccio, it may well be in the context of that petrol emotion.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, you take care of yourself. We'll see if we can convince Dave to rustle up a wee effigy of you and see if you can use that for anything. And, Mark, we will be back remarkably soon.
Such
is our schedule right now. We'll be back remarkably soon with the man himself, David John Weaver, to discuss what a bunch of cocks music journalists are.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Ciao,
Cheers.
ragazzi.
Bye. Ciao ragazzi. Ciao. Ciao da Bologna.